what kind of remedy would a landlord have against a tenant who is engaging in this type of conduct? In other words, is there some type of theory a landlord can go forward on, aside from kind of a garden variety illegal sublet case, which I think is simpler in both theory and practice, the way that it works out. The form lease has a provision in it, and most leases do, that say that if a tenant does something to violate building codes or housing maintenance codes or something like that, that's a potential ground upon which to terminate a tenancy. Right off the top of my head, one example I can think of is the housing maintenance code says that tenants are supposed to give access, although that particular provision applies to HPD as opposed to landlords, but landlords often cite to it anyway. But certainly I think that if a tenant is violating a code in a way that puts a landlord exposed to liability at the ECB level, the DOB level, I think a landlord does state a cause of action against a tenant, which again circles us back to the interesting question of whether or not a cure is available. Certainly tenants who, let's say, engage in illegal alterations where, let's say, they do, to pick an example out of the air, electrical code work that violates the building code, and if a landlord has a cause of action against that, the tenant in an illegal alterations case can cure. And there's case law, most of the case law on that topic deals with an inability to cure within 10 days. So if a cure is initiated within 10 days and the tenant diligently pursues it, they can go ahead with that. You see that in a legal alterations context, case 8th 19th against Scarano. That's an appellate term case from 1992. So certainly if a tenant violates building codes in a legal alteration situation and still gets a cure, does that apply also in a scenario where a tenant may be violating the building code by renting their apartment out on Airbnb? And I'll circle back to what I said before, which is from my read of the authority out there, the appellate authority, is that the only exception that I've seen to a tenant being able to cure this type of activity, whether you want to call it sublet or something else, is if the tenant is undermining the rent regulatory scheme in New York City. The rent stabilization, rent control is based on the theory that there's a crisis in this city, there's a housing shortage, and if tenants are profiteering off of that, particularly if they're not living there, I think that's probably a worse fact than if they are, although a couple of these scenarios, particularly Brookfield against Penrod, the tenant was living there all along and the court found that to be incurable.